In the last section of the peripheral nervous system, we are going to discuss reflexes. We're going to take a look at the types of stimuli that cause reflexes, how the reflexes help maintain homeostasis in the body. We'll outline and describe some of these spinal reflex arcs, and we'll discuss proprioceptive sensations and reflexes. Somatic reflexes are quick, involuntary, stereotyped reactions of glands or muscles to sensory stimulation. These are automatic responses to sensory input that occur without our intent or even our awareness. Their intention is to help maintain homeostasis. In a somatic reflex arc, we stimulate somatic receptors. These are generally receptors within the skin for pain, pressure, temperature, or receptors within the joints or muscles, so proprioceptors, that give information about tension and stretch in the joints and muscles. From the somatic receptor, we go through afferent fibers, which carry the signal to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. In the gray matter of the spinal cord, one or more interneurons integrate the information and send a response. The response is sent on efferent motor fibers that carry impulses to the skeletal muscles. The skeletal muscles then respond and cause the body to do something. The general components of a reflex arc include the receptor, the dendrites that are located in the skin. The axon from those dendrites carries the information to the spinal cord through that afferent sensory neuron. The interneuron in the gray matter of the spinal cord is the integration center and sends a signal out through the motor neuron, which leaves through the ventral gray horn of the spinal cord and the ventral nerve root to go out and innervate the effector and cause that effector to do something. The first reflex we're going to discuss is the stretch or myotactic reflex. This reflex involves a proprioceptor that's an interoceptor, it's inside of the body, and it's called the muscle spindle. This is encapsulated nerve endings that sense the length of the muscle and how fast the muscle is changing length. The muscle spindle is composed of intrafusal muscle fibers. These are muscle fibers that can contract, but that are within the capsule of the muscle spindle. Their job is to keep the muscle spindle from getting flabby. Afferent fibers are the sensory fibers that detect the amount of stretch in the muscle. And gamma motor neurons are the motor neurons that go to the intrafusal muscle fibers. These are different than our alpha motor neurons that go to most of the muscle, which we call extrafusal muscle fibers. Our muscle spindle shows alpha-gamma co-activation. This causes the intrafusal muscles to contract along with the muscle fibers that are extrafusal or outside of the muscle spindle. The muscle spindle capsule surrounds the intrafusal muscle fibers, the sensory fibers, and the gamma motor neuron. You can see in the left part of the diagram how muscle stretch is detected. When muscle is stretched, the mechanoreceptors in the sensory fiber are going to be stimulated, and they're going to cause local potentials, which will then generate action potentials. If there's a bigger stimulus because of more stretch, more action potentials will be generated. This increased rate of action potentials translates to a stronger amount of stretch. If we only activated our alpha motor neurons, these alpha motor neurons are the same motor neurons we've been discussing for the last few weeks, but we haven't called them alpha motor neurons. So those normal motor neurons are going to be alpha motor neurons. They stimulate the extrafusal muscle fibers to contract. These extrafusal muscle fibers are the normal muscle fibers we've been discussing. If they contracted without the muscle spindle shortening, we would have a lack of action potentials due to the floppiness of the muscle spindle. However, if the gamma motor neuron, which innervates the intrafusal fibers, is stimulated at the same time as the alpha motor neuron, the muscle spindle maintains tension, and the muscle spindle can still signal changes in length. So we get a series of action potentials that are sent to the central nervous system. So alpha-gamma co-activation is important, so the muscle spindle can signal the central nervous system at any muscle length. So the myotactic or stretch reflex is when a muscle is stretched and it contracts and maintains an increased tone. It helps maintain equilibrium in posture. An example of this is when you start to fall asleep and your head starts to tip forward, and as your head falls at a faster and faster rate and the muscles at the back of your neck are stretched very quickly, those muscles will contract and raise the head back up. That's the jerk you see as people wake up. The myotactic reflex also helps to stabilize joints by balancing tension in the extensors and flexors and smoothing muscle actions. A very sudden muscle stretch is the biggest stimulus that causes this reflex to occur. One example of the stretch or myotactic reflex is the knee jerk reflex or the patellar tendon reflex. This is a monosynaptic reflex, meaning that there is only one synapse between the afferent and efferent neurons. We have other stretch reflexes that are polysynaptic reflexes. There's an interneuron in between. And testing somatic reflexes can help diagnose some diseases. One thing to note about the stretch reflex is that when we have the stretch reflex occurring, we will also have reciprocal inhibition. Reciprocal inhibition prevents muscles from working against each other, and when the agonist is stimulated, reciprocal inhibition causes the antagonist to be inhibited and relax. Here's our patellar tendon reflex. Our muscle spindle, when it is stretched, especially stretched rapidly, and it can be stretched by tapping on the patellar tendon or ligament, which then transmits that stretch back into the quadriceps muscles. The muscle spindle sensory fiber sends a signal, an action potential, through the dorsal root and into the dorsal horn. The little pluses and minuses you see in the spinal cord represent excitation and inhibition. So the sensory neuron is going to release an excitatory neurotransmitter on the pink alpha motor neuron that goes back out to the quadriceps group. This excites that motor neuron, and that motor neuron then will excite the muscle and cause it to contract. At the same time the quadricep muscle is being excited, an interneuron is stimulated, and this interneuron releases an inhibitory neurotransmitter onto the motor neuron for the hamstring muscle group. This inhibitory neurotransmitter inhibits the generation of action potentials in this motor neuron. Because there's no action potentials in the motor neuron, there's no contraction in the hamstring muscle, and therefore the hamstrings will relax. The Golgi tendon reflex is another reflex that's controlled by a different proprioceptive organ. When the Golgi tendon reflex is triggered, it controls muscle tension by causing muscle relaxation. So the stimulus for the Golgi tendon reflex is excessive tension, and it responds by causing relaxation or inhibition of the motor neuron. The Golgi tendon reflex is named after an old dead guy named Camillo Golgi. He was Italian. The Golgi apparatus is also named after the same gentleman, and the Golgi tendon organ, which is part of the Golgi tendon reflex, also named after the same guy. The Golgi tendon organ is a group of encapsulated proprioceptors that are within a tendon near its junction with a muscle. This encapsulated nerve bundle is about 1 millimeter long, so it's very small, and it detects tension. When there's excessive tension on the tendon, then the Golgi tendon organ detects that excessive tension and sends an excitatory signal up to the neurons it synapses with. This is a polysynaptic reflex arc, so both branches of this sensory fiber synapse on interneurons. The sensory fiber stimulates these interneurons, and these interneurons allow our signal to be transmitted properly to cause this reflex. You'll see the interneuron on the left releases an inhibitory neurotransmitter. This inhibitory neurotransmitter will inhibit the pink motor neuron that goes out to the quadriceps muscle group. So if the quadriceps muscle group is producing excessive tension, the tendon organ is stimulated, sends action potentials up to the dorsal horn, releases an excitatory neurotransmitter onto an interneuron. The interneuron inhibits the motor neuron. No acetylcholine is released at the muscle and no contraction occurs. Hence, it relaxes. At the same time, the interneuron on the right is going to release an excitatory neurotransmitter onto the antagonist muscle. This motor neuron that goes out to the antagonist muscle is stimulated by the excitatory neurotransmitter and releases acetylcholine at the antagonist muscle, which causes the antagonist muscle to contract. This Golgi tendon reflex is a protective reflex and also functions when the muscle contracts unevenly. The flexor withdrawal reflex occurs during withdrawal of the limb from pain. It is a polysynaptic reflex arc, which means there's more than one synapse, and the neural circuitry in the spinal cord controls not only which muscles are contracted, but what order they're stimulated and contracted in, and how long they contract for. So the spinal cord integrates this whole process. The stimulus in this case happens to be a pain stimulus, and it's going to be the person grabbing the other person's arm. This also works with your leg, so if you step on something like a glass bottle that has been broken or a Lego in the middle of the night, that will also cause this flexor withdrawal reflex. So it works at both your arms and your legs. This pain stimulus is transmitted up the sensory neuron into the dorsal gray horn, and we release an excitatory neurotransmitter. This excitatory neurotransmitter excites our first interneuron. This first interneuron will stimulate our next two interneurons. So there's a couple interneurons in this pathway. One interneuron will inhibit the motor neurons that go to the extensors. When the motor neurons going to the extensors are inhibited, the extensor muscles will relax. This other interneuron stimulates the motor neuron that goes to the flexor muscles. When the flexor muscles are stimulated, the arm flexes. So the elbow flexes and the shoulder will flex as well. The same thing could happen at the leg, where the knee and the hip would flex in response to a painful stimulus. This is the flexor withdrawal reflex, and it will result in the hand moving away from the painful stimulus. There's withdrawal from the painful stimulus. Note, there is also this fiber right here that's going across the spinal cord. That's because the flexor withdrawal reflex is paired with our next reflex, the crossed extensor reflex. That interneuron from the flexor withdrawal reflex that headed across the spinal cord comes across and begins stimulating interneurons on the opposite side, the contralateral side of the spinal cord. The crossed extensor reflex maintains balance by extending the contralateral arm or leg when you pull away from a painful stimulus. This is an intersegmental reflex, so it not only will go across the spinal cord, but it will also go up the spinal cord and down the spinal cord in order to stimulate muscles above and below where the painful stimuli happened. This is a contralateral reflex arc. So something happens on the left side of the body and it activates muscles on the other side of the body. So in this reflex arc, we have our interneuron that comes from the flexor withdrawal reflex. So there's pain in one arm or leg. It comes across the spinal cord, and we stimulate the motor neuron that goes out to our extensors. At the same time we stimulate our extensors, we inhibit the motor neuron that goes out to our flexors. So our flexors are inhibited, our extensors are stimulated, and that causes extension of the arm or leg. So this body part extends to help keep balance or have something to stand on if we're discussing the legs. So if we put these two reflexes together, you can see the painful stimuli, which starts this reflex, this hand grabbing the arm. The stimuli goes up through the afferent neuron. That afferent fiber goes up into the dorsal gray horn, stimulates interneurons. Those interneurons have an ipsilateral, same side, effect of flexing the limb away from the painful stimulus, and they have a contralateral effect of extending the opposite arm. In order to do that, we have to stimulate the motor neuron which flexes the ipsilateral arm. At the same time, we're inhibiting the extensors in the ipsilateral arm. So the extensors would be inhibited because of reciprocal inhibition of the antagonist muscle group. On the opposite side, we're going to have the opposite thing happening. So contralateral side, we're going to stimulate the extensors and inhibit the flexors. And that finishes our discussion of peripheral reflexes.